What if the love story that convinced millions of Americans was never the full story but only the safest version we were allowed to see? For years, the public was told a simple, emotionally satisfying narrative. A hard-working American actress, underestimated and mistreated, meets a wounded prince searching for purpose. Two outsiders find each other, challenge an ancient institution, and walk away to build a new life on their own terms. It sounded modern, it sounded fair, and for many people, especially here in the United States, it felt deeply relatable. But here's the problem. That story depends on one critical assumption, that everything began the night they met. What if it didn't? What if the relationship that captivated the world was not the beginning of a journey, but the final chapter of a much longer one? A journey that unfolded quietly across private clubs, invitation-only circles, and social ecosystems most people never see? Tonight, we are not here to attack personalities. We are not here to trade gossip or internet outrage. Instead, we're going to examine systems, how power circulates, how access is granted, and how certain lives change direction long before the public notices. This is not a story about villains and heroes. It's a story about infrastructure, about how elite worlds function behind velvet ropes, and about what happens when genuine emotion collides with carefully built networks. At the center of this story stand two real people: Meghan Markle, whose public image became one of the most debated in modern media history, and Prince Harry, a man driven by grief, loyalty, and the belief that he was rescuing someone he loved. But by the end of this video, you may find yourself asking a very different question. Not who is right, but who really understood the game. Stay with us, because once the first door opens, every chapter that follows changes meaning. To understand how certain lives change direction without headlines or announcements, we need to step away from tabloids and step into a quieter reality, the world behind the velvet rope. Most people imagine power as something loud: boardrooms, elections, press conferences. But for decades, some of the most influential relationships in media, finance, and politics have formed far from cameras, inside private ecosystems built specifically to filter who gets access and who does not. One of the most visible examples of this modern system is Soho House. On the surface, it presents itself as a lifestyle brand: tasteful interiors, curated guest lists, a creative atmosphere. But to those who study elite social structures, it represents something more important: a gatekeeping mechanism. Membership is not just about money, it is about placement, reputation, and perceived future value. These environments function very differently from public spaces. Conversations are not casual, introductions are rarely accidental, and relationships, once formed, tend to compound over time. A single invitation can quietly lead to another. A dinner becomes a weekend becomes a circle, and suddenly someone who was once peripheral begins to feel established. This is how influence often travels in the modern age, not through titles but through proximity. For individuals on the margins of fame, actors, media personalities, entrepreneurs without institutional backing, these spaces can be transformative. They offer something far more valuable than money: endorsement by association. Being seen in the right room signals credibility long before resumes catch up. What's important to understand is that none of this is illegal, secret, or even rare. It's simply unfamiliar to most people, especially to audiences raised on the idea that success is always linear and visible. Work hard, get noticed, get promoted. Elite systems don't work that way. They operate on observation, on vetting, on trust built slowly, often informally, over years. A person doesn't need to be famous to be interesting inside these circles. They need to be adaptable, discreet, socially fluent, someone who fits seamlessly into multiple environments without drawing attention to themselves. And this is where the public narrative often breaks down. When audiences later encounter someone who appears to have come out of nowhere, the assumption is luck, or timing, or destiny. Rarely do people ask the more uncomfortable question: where were they being shaped before we noticed them? These networks don't announce themselves when they work. In fact, their success depends on silence. No press releases, no confirmations, just patterns, consistent access, repeated invitations, familiar faces reappearing in rooms closed to almost everyone else. Understanding this world doesn't require believing in conspiracies. It requires acknowledging something far simpler: that power prefers predictability, discretion, and people who already understand its rules. And once someone has learned to navigate these spaces, once they've been tested, observed, and accepted, their trajectory rarely resets. It evolves. In the next section, we're going to look closely at a critical period when public records suggested modest professional progress, while social visibility quietly expanded behind the scenes. Because sometimes the most important chapters of a story are the ones no one thought to read at the time. Between the late 2000s and the early 2010 seconds, the public record tells a familiar story. Meghan Markle was working steadily but modestly small television appearances, auditions that didn't always lead anywhere, and a resume that looked like thousands of others trying to gain traction in a crowded industry. It was the grind phase, the years most actors describe as survival, not ascent. On paper, there was nothing unusual here. But public resumes rarely capture the full picture of a person's trajectory, especially when progress isn't measured by credits alone. Around this period, observers who track social ecosystems, rather than box office numbers, noticed something subtle but consistent: increased visibility in circles that didn't align neatly with a struggling actor narrative. Not magazine covers, not red carpets, but presence repeated. Quiet presence in environments that tend to be closed to outsiders. This is where it becomes important to separate career momentum from social momentum. Career momentum is easy to document. It's public. It shows up in IMDb listings, casting announcements, and press interviews. Social momentum, on the other hand, leaves a lighter footprint. It appears in who is invited, who is introduced, and who continues to be welcomed back. During this stretch of years, there was a widening gap between the two. Professionally, progress was incremental. Socially, the curve appeared steeper. That discrepancy alone does not imply wrongdoing or manipulation. In fact, it mirrors a pattern seen across multiple industries: entertainment, politics, finance, where individuals begin building relationships before the public sees tangible outcomes. Success, in these cases, is not sudden. It is delayed visibility. What made this period notable was not fame, but placement. Placement means being in rooms where future decisions are shaped. It means being recognized as someone who belongs, not because of current achievements, but because of perceived potential. These judgments are rarely written down. They're intuitive, relational, and often influenced by who vouches for whom. And vouching matters. Inside elite circles, introductions are reputational transactions. When someone brings a new person into a closed environment, they are implicitly attaching their own credibility to that individual. This is why access tends to expand gradually. One invitation leads to another, not because of chance, but because nothing went wrong the first time. Those who have studied these systems often describe an informal evaluation process. Not interviews, not tests, but observation over time. How someone listens, how they handle discretion, whether they understand when to speak and when not to. From the outside, this period looks quiet, uneventful even. But from the inside, it can be formative. And this is where the public narrative becomes incomplete. The story most people later heard suggested that transformation began with a single meeting, a single romance, a single leap into a new world. But lives rarely change that cleanly, especially not in environments where trust is the primary currency. A more accurate way to view this phase is as preparation. Not preparation in a formal sense, no training manuals or explicit plans, but exposure. Repeated immersion in settings that normalize power, wealth, and influence. Over time, what once felt intimidating becomes familiar. What once felt aspirational becomes navigable. This matters because familiarity changes behavior. People who have spent years around influence tend to approach it differently than those encountering it for the first time. They ask different questions. They read rooms faster. They understand the unspoken hierarchies that govern elite spaces. By the time the public finally noticed a dramatic shift, the internal adjustment had already happened. Which raises a critical point. When audiences later encountered a woman stepping confidently into one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world, many assumed she was learning on the fly, that she was overwhelmed, that she was unprepared. But confidence rarely appears overnight. In the next section, we'll examine the figure often credited quietly, rarely on record, with facilitating introductions, smoothing transitions, and understanding how these worlds overlap. Because in stories shaped by access, connectors matter just as much as protagonists. Every system of power has its visible figures, leaders, celebrities, decision-makers, but behind them, almost always unnoticed by the public, are individuals whose influence does not come from authority, wealth, or fame, but from connection. These are the connectors. They rarely seek attention. They do not dominate headlines, yet they move effortlessly between worlds that rarely intersect: entertainment and finance, politics and culture, old money and new ambition. Their value lies not in what they own, but in who trusts them. In elite social ecosystems, connectors perform a critical function. They reduce risk. When a closed circle considers welcoming someone new, it is not credentials alone that matter. What matters is reassurance, the quiet confidence that someone else has already observed, vetted, and deemed this person acceptable. This is where figures like Marcus Anderson enter the narrative, not as villains, not as masterminds, but as examples of a well-established role. For years, Anderson has been publicly associated with Soho House, an institution designed to bring together people of influence across creative, political, and financial spheres. His professional responsibility was not to promote individual careers, but to curate environments to ensure the right mix of personalities, discretion, and compatibility. In these settings, relationships do not begin with introductions like, "This person will change your life." They begin far more subtly: a shared table, a private conversation, a return invitation. Over time, familiarity builds, and familiarity lowers barriers. What is often misunderstood is that connectors do not create ambition, they recognize it. They notice who adapts easily, who understands social rhythm, who navigates conversations without forcing attention. These qualities are not glamorous, but they are prized. In rooms where power already exists, disruption is less valuable than fluency. From this perspective, the role of a connector is less about manipulation and more about alignment. When observers later look back and see patterns, recurring appearances, expanding access, seamless transitions, it can be tempting to assume orchestration. But in reality, these systems often function through repetition rather than planning. Someone is invited because they fit. They are invited again because nothing went wrong. And that consistency is everything. This is why stories of sudden transformation can be misleading. What appears sudden to the public is often the result of years of quiet placement. A connector doesn't push someone upward. They simply stop blocking doors once trust has been established. In this light, the introductions that would later shape public history begin to look less like chance and more like inevitability, not because outcomes were guaranteed, but because the environment had already been prepared. It is also important to note what connectors do not do. They do not control emotions. They do not manufacture affection. When two people form a genuine bond, that bond is real regardless of how the meeting occurred. But the conditions that allow such meetings to happen repeatedly, privately, and without friction are rarely accidental. For audiences watching from the outside, this distinction matters. It is entirely possible for a relationship to be emotionally authentic and structurally facilitated at the same time. These two realities are not mutually exclusive, though public narratives often insist they must be. And this brings us to a moment worth pausing on. As we consider how introductions shape lives, it's worth reflecting on our own perspective. Many of you watching have lived through decades of social change, institutional power, and media reinvention. You understand that systems matter sometimes more than individuals. If you're comfortable sharing, we invite you to leave a brief comment, noting the city or country from which you're watching tonight. It helps ground this discussion in the real, global community engaging with these questions. Because the story we're exploring does not belong to one nation or one culture, it reflects a broader truth about how influence travels quietly, relationally, and often invisibly. In the next section, we'll examine what happens when genuine emotion enters a system designed around access and reputation, and how love, once inside such an infrastructure, can amplify consequences no one fully anticipates. That intersection between feeling and framework is where this story truly begins to change. When the public first learned of the relationship, the story felt unmistakably human. Prince Harry was introduced as a man shaped by loss, service, and an instinct to protect. He had grown up under constant scrutiny, learned early how institutions can wound as well as shelter, and carried a deep skepticism toward the machinery of the press. To many Americans, especially those who have watched public life harden over decades, his posture was understandable, even admirable. He appeared to recognize something familiar in Meghan Markle: independence, resilience, and a desire to define life on her own terms. The attraction did not look strategic. It looked emotional, and, by all accounts, it was. But emotion does not exist in a vacuum. When romance enters an environment shaped by access, reputation, and expectation, it doesn't replace the structure, it moves through it. And that distinction matters. In elite ecosystems, relationships are rarely isolated events. They are intersections. Two lives don't just meet. Two networks touch. Friends become advisors. Advisors become stakeholders. Stakeholders develop opinions, sometimes quietly, sometimes urgently, about what is at risk and what must be protected. For Harry, love offered clarity. He knew who he was in the relationship: the defender, the one who would not repeat history, the one who would step between the woman he loved and an institution he believed had already caused irreparable harm. That role aligned perfectly with his lived experience. But roles can be powerful precisely because they simplify complex realities. When someone believes they are rescuing another person, they often stop asking questions that might complicate the narrative. They focus forward, not backward, on building a future, not examining the scaffolding beneath the present. From the outside, the pace of the relationship raised eyebrows. From the inside, it likely felt inevitable. By the time the world noticed, familiarity had already been established. Trust had already formed. And when trust forms under emotional pressure, it tends to harden quickly. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Hesitation becomes betrayal. This dynamic helps explain why warnings when they came were often dismissed, not because they were wrong, but because they threatened the emotional coherence of the story Harry was living inside. It is also important to recognize that for Meghan, entering this relationship did not mean entering power for the first time. It meant entering a different kind of power, one that operated with older rules, harsher visibility, and far less tolerance for ambiguity. The shift was not from obscurity to prominence. It was from informal influence to institutional scrutiny. That transition is jarring for anyone. In informal systems, missteps are absorbed quietly. In formal institutions, they are documented, archived, and remembered. Informal environments reward adaptability. Formal ones reward conformity. Navigating the difference requires not just confidence, but a precise understanding of what cannot be changed. As their relationship progressed, the contrast between these systems became impossible to ignore. Harry believed love could outrun structure. That commitment could override hierarchy. That personal loyalty would be enough to counter institutional inertia. These beliefs were sincere and deeply human. But institutions do not respond to sincerity. They respond to precedent. And as pressure mounted, every decision carried weight beyond the couple themselves. Statements became signals. Appearances became messages. Silence became strategy. This is where many observers felt something shift. What had begun as a personal relationship increasingly appeared to operate on multiple levels at once: emotional, symbolic, and strategic, each layer influencing the others, often unintentionally. The tragedy, if it can be called, that lies in the collision of two truths. It can be true that a relationship is real, and it can also be true that it unfolds within systems that shape outcomes regardless of intention. By the time lines were drawn and positions hardened, there was no clean exit, only consequences for families, for reputations, and for identities built over a lifetime. In the next section, we'll look at how symbols, timing, and silence began to speak louder than words, and why, in elite environments, what goes unsaid often carries the greatest meaning. In environments shaped by power, symbols matter more than explanations. Words can be clarified, statements revised, narratives adjusted, but symbols endure. They linger. They are remembered long after press releases fade. As public scrutiny intensified, observers began focusing less on what was said and more on what was shown. Appearances, objects, timing, and perhaps most telling of all, silence. Silence, in elite systems, is rarely empty. In ordinary life, silence can mean confusion or restraint. In high-stakes environments, it often signals calculation. Decisions are weighed not only by how they will be received today, but by how they will be interpreted years from now, across cultures and institutions that do not forget easily. This is why certain moments drew disproportionate attention, not because they were explosive on their own, but because they seemed out of step with expectations, and expectation is the invisible rulebook of elite life. Symbols operate differently across cultures. An object that appears ornamental to one audience may carry layered meaning to another. Jewelry, for example, is not merely decorative in many diplomatic and royal contexts. It can signify alliance, acknowledgement, continuity, or closure depending on timing and provenance. This is where discussions began to quietly include figures like Mohammed bin Salman, not as an accusation, but as a contextual reference point. In global power structures, associations are rarely casual. Gestures are deliberate. Gifts, when acknowledged, are often embedded within established customs that outsiders may misinterpret or overlook entirely. What unsettled many observers was not the existence of such symbols, but the apparent unwillingness to address them directly. No clarification, no contextual framing, just absence. And absence invites interpretation. For institutions built on continuity, unexplained gestures are disruptive. They create uncertainty. And uncertainty, in these environments, is far more dangerous than controversy. Controversy can be managed. Uncertainty spreads. This helps explain why responses, when they came at all, were measured to the point of opacity. Legal teams remained cautious. Statements avoided specifics. Corrections were rare. Each move appeared designed not to convince the public, but to avoid triggering processes that cannot be reversed. Because in elite disputes, escalation is often more damaging than accusation. To challenge a narrative formally can require opening records, timelines, communications not just of individuals, but of entire networks. Once exposed, those networks do not simply defend themselves. They reassess loyalty. They reprice risk. Silence, then, becomes a form of containment. For the public, this can feel unsatisfying. People expect denial, explanation, or apology. But those expectations reflect a different social contract, one built for transparency, not preservation. What many fail to realize is that elite systems prioritize future stability over present clarity. If speaking today increases uncertainty tomorrow, silence is chosen. Timing amplifies this effect. Questions that might have seemed manageable at one moment can become intolerable at another. Context shifts. Global politics change. Alliances harden. What could once be dismissed becomes radioactive. This is why timing, more than content, determines response. When symbols resurface years later, detached from their original context but loaded with accumulated meaning, institutions respond differently. What once felt private now feels historical. What once felt personal now feels archival. And archives are dangerous. Archives do not argue, they wait. As the public narrative evolved, many began to sense that what they were witnessing was not an unfolding explanation, but a containment strategy. Not a debate, but a standoff. Each side aware that full transparency would be mutually destructive. This realization reframes the story entirely. The question is no longer, what is true? It becomes, what is too costly to say? For individuals caught between personal identity and institutional memory, this is an impossible position. Every option carries loss. Speaking risks exposure. Silence invites speculation. Retreat looks like admission. Engagement looks like escalation. And so, the system defaults to stillness. In the final section, we'll step back from personalities and symbols to examine the larger consequence of all this, the cost of reinvention in a world where nothing truly disappears, and where the past does not fade quietly. Because in elite systems, history is never erased. It is simply deferred. When the noise finally fades, what remains is not scandal, not rumor, and not even personalities, but a lesson about life in a world where reinvention is celebrated, yet memory never truly disappears. We live in an age that encourages us to believe we can rewrite ourselves endlessly. New chapters, new platforms, new narratives. And in many ways, that belief is healthy. Growth matters. Change matters. Second acts matter, especially to those of us who have lived long enough to know that life rarely moves in straight lines. But there is a quieter truth we often avoid. Every reinvention carries its past with it, not as punishment, but as context. Elite systems understand this better than anyone. They document. They remember. They don't rush judgment, but they don't forget investments, either emotional, reputational, or relational. What looks like freedom on the surface often comes with invisible obligations beneath it. From my personal perspective, this story is less about choosing sides and more about understanding scale. When individual emotion collides with institutional memory, the institution almost always outlasts the moment. Not because it is cruel, but because it is designed to endure. And perhaps that is the most human takeaway here. Love can be real, intentions can be sincere, and consequences can still arrive. For those watching who have navigated careers, families, and changing social worlds over decades, this may feel familiar. We all carry versions of ourselves that others remember differently than we do. The older we get, the more we realize that clarity is rare and humility is essential. If you found this perspective thoughtful or worth discussing, please take a moment to like this video. It helps thoughtful conversations reach people who value them. I'd also invite you to leave a comment, not about outrage, but reflection. What do you believe matters more in the long run? Intention or awareness of the system you're entering? And if you appreciate long-form analysis that treats its audience with respect, consider subscribing to the channel. We're here to explore stories beyond headlines with patience, context, and care. Thank you for spending this time with us.